There are anomalies that defy rational explanation. There are inadvertent transgressions that leave behind a permanent, haunting psychological scar. This is the chronicle of arguably the most grotesque case of mistaken identity in local history, unfolding in late 1998 within Da Coc Hamlet, Thong Son Commune, Thon Son District, Phu Tho Province, Vietnam, now known as Cu Dong Commune. Spanning across a turn of the century, the horrific narrative of the 1998 chimpanzee bone glue bone broth rendering continues to cast a dark, indelible shadow over the wilderness of Da Coc. In the waning years of the 20th century, the inhabitants of Da Coc Hamlet subsisted primarily on the surrounding forestry and rugged terrain. During this era, wealthy timber plantation proprietors routinely retained local villagers to secure and cultivate their expansive estates. Among them was Nguyen Van Ngach, a prominent timberland owner in Da Coc. To safeguard his investment on Dong Coc Hill, Ngach employed laborers residing approximately 3 kilometers from the perimeter to conduct daily patrols. Dinh Van Ngach, born 1946, a seasoned local hunter intimately familiar with the labyrinthine mountain passes, was contracted for the task. From then on, Ngach combined his daily hunting expeditions with security sweeps of the plantation. Ngach was not alone in monitoring these ridges. An adjacent 18-hectare sector was managed by Dinh Van Tam, born 1948, a resident of Dak Kem Hamlet, Hoang Con Commune. Life in these highlands moved at a slow, impoverished yet undisturbed pace. That tranquility shattered on the late night of November 29, 1998. While resting in his outpost, Tam was startled by a massive detonation. Investigating the perimeter, he observed flames and smoke billowing from a localized fire on the opposite ridge. Hypothesizing that it was merely nocturnal poachers smoking out wild beehives, a common occurrence in the region, Tam dismissed the anomaly and returned to his quarters. 2 days later, an urgent trip summoned Tam to Hajiang Province. The incident of the midnight blast and the remote fire remained unmentioned, buried under the assumption of routine poaching. On the afternoon of December 5, 1998, days after the unverified detonation, Dinh Van Ngach stumbled upon a heavily charred mass on the exact hill where the fire had occurred. The object was profoundly disfigured by intense thermal trauma, making anatomical identification difficult. However, its silhouette resembled a large primate, though its dimensions far exceeded any local fauna. Ngach conducted a prolonged inspection. Despite the extensive charring, the specimen exhibited a distinct hunched back, elongated and robust lower limbs, and swollen forelimbs, terminating in long, curled digits. The intense heat had caused the cervical muscles to contract, pulling the neck back and jutting the jaw upward, exposing a stark white grimacing dentition. The hunter deduced the specimen was an exotic animal caught in the wildfire. Examining the skeletal framework, he became convinced it was a rare chimpanzee carcass. Securing the remains with durable forest vines, Ngach hoisted the load onto his shoulders and dragged it back to the hamlet. News spread instantly. Villagers of all ages converged on Ngach's courtyard to marvel at the exotic specimen, a creature unprecedented in the local biosphere. Operating under the absolute conviction that they possessed a rare commodity, Ngach enlisted his kinsmen and neighbors the following morning to render the carcass into traditional medicinal bone glue, CAO. Armed with cleavers, butcher blocks, and water ladles, a team of 10 men transported the remains to the large communal pond at the edge of the village to wash, dissect, and process the specimen. The entire hamlet gathered to witness the macabre spectacle. Subsequently, dozens of villagers took rotating shifts to monitor the boiling cauldron, driven by the novelty of the rare prize. After 3 consecutive days and nights, the process was complete. Upon removing the cauldron from the fire, several participants noted inconsistencies. Standard bone glue typically hardens into a dense, dark brown substance. This batch, however, remained anomalous, pale red in complexion and unusually soft. Nevertheless, the discrepancy was collectively rationalized. A rare chimpanzee would naturally yield a substance distinct from common macaque glue. The villagers subsequently procured rice wine, dissolving a portion of the gelatinous extract into the alcohol to share among themselves. That evening, a significant portion of Da Coc's male population participated in the consumption. Nearly a week later, Dinh Van Ngach returned from his journey and overheard rumors of the prized primate. Upon discovering that the carcass had been salvaged near the site of the midnight fire, Tam experienced an immediate sense of foreboding. Approaching the drinking assembly, Tam interjected, warning them of a catastrophic error, arguing that chimpanzees did not exist in the region. His warning was met with aggressive dismissal. The intoxicated villagers countered that since he had not witnessed the carcass, his skepticism was invalid. Realizing the futility of arguing with inebriated men, Tam issued a calculated challenge. He dared them to accompany him back to the origin site to verify the truth. Driven by alcohol and bravado, the men marched up the ridge to the location where Ngach had recovered the remains. There, a grim discovery would unravel the illusion of the prized primate. Following Tam up the ridge, the group arrived at the scene of the fire. The topography made the site instantly recognizable, a flattened scorched clearing measuring roughly the size of 2 traditional woven mats. Tam took the initiative, utilizing a makeshift staff to sift through the cold, bleak ash layer. Within moments, the debris yielded damning artifacts: a brass clothing button, an aluminum hair clip, and several fragments of partially consumed gray fabric. As suspicion turned to dread, Tam continued his search of the perimeter, discovering several half-burnt logs intertwined with long strands of material structurally identical to human hair. The realization struck the assembly with paralyzing force. The psychological weight of what they had actually processed began to sink in. Tam gathered the forensic remnants, turned to the trembling men, and stated flatly, "Chimpanzees do not exist in these hills, and chimpanzees do not have human hair or clothing accoutrements." An unprecedented panic gripped the group. Overwhelmed by profound revulsion, they retreated to the village. Tam, tasked with securing the recovered physical evidence, refused to return to his isolated forest outpost that night, seeking refuge within the hamlet instead. The artifacts in his possession felt physically and metaphorically oppressive. Concurrently, local authorities received reports regarding the alleged processing of a rare animal. However, by the time a field officer was dispatched to the location, the cauldron had already been drained. Days later, Tam formally surrendered the physical evidence to investigators. A forensic team was immediately deployed to exhume the site and examine the remaining biological matter. The definitive forensic conclusion sent shockwaves through the community. The biological mass they had dissected, boiled, and processed was not an animal. It was a human corpse. Because the community had operated under the collective delusion that the remains were animalistic, dozens of individuals had directly handled, observed, or assisted in the butchering and rendering process. The revelation triggered widespread psychological trauma. The rendering process had yielded approximately 1 kilogram of soft pale red gelatin. Believing it to be a potent health elixir, numerous villagers had infused it into their spirits. Consumers later recalled that the concoction possessed a distinct, nauseating and gamey odor that immediately assaulted the sinuses. Upon learning the true nature of the substance, affected villagers spent a week in a futile state of self-induced vomiting, unable to purge the psychological horror. Hoang Van Dung, the veteran village chief of Da Coc who had inspected the remains prior to processing, recalled the profound anatomical distortion caused by the fire. The torso was severely hunched, the lower extremities were unusually elongated and robust, the fingers were rigidly contracted into claws with overgrown nails, and the upper limbs appeared distended. It bore a striking resemblance to illustrations or television broadcasts of large primates. The morphological distortion was so profound that even I was entirely convinced it was an exotic animal, Chief Dung admitted. Due to the significant proportions of the mass, villagers had actually moved it to the central courtyard to document its weight and dimensions. Another eyewitness, Nguyen Van Dong, born 1964, stated, "They told me it was a rare, highly therapeutic elixir, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I consumed 2 glasses. The odor was intensely gamey, penetrating straight into the nasal passages. It was a foulness so unique that there is simply nothing in existence to compare it to." Investigators subsequently detained and interrogated over 20 individuals who had directly participated in or witnessed the rendering process. The depositions were uniform. None possessed the mens rea guilty mind or awareness that they were desecrating human remains. The hunter who discovered the body maintained that when he recovered the mass, it was already in an advanced state of superficial decomposition, heavily beset by insects. Because the primary identification was flawed, the underlying cause of death remained completely unknown to the villagers. Consequently, criminal charges regarding the desecration of a corpse were withheld due to a lack of criminal intent. Witnesses recall that on the afternoon detectives were preparing to transport the physical evidence, the rendered blocks, to the Viet Tri-City Forensic Laboratory, an urgent landline call was received at the Thang Son Commune People's Committee. The caller was an official from the neighboring Yen Luang commune. The communication reported the missing person case of Dinh Thi Minh, born 1949, a resident of Squad 7, Yen Luang commune, who had vanished on November 29th. At the time of her disappearance, Min was wearing yellow rubber sandals, a white conical hat, carrying a textile clothing bag and a plastic water canister. Even prior to comparative DNA profiling, the physical evidence recovered from the ash pile provided a 90% circumstantial match to the missing woman. Dinh Van Son, the victim's younger brother, noted that his sister was the second oldest of 5 siblings. In her youth, she had attended a teacher's preparatory academy, but the institution was dissolved due to wartime exigencies, forcing her to return to the agrarian family estate. While her siblings married and established independent households, Min remained unwed, cultivating the land to support her aging parents and younger brother. Zoan remembered his sister as a gentle, industrious, and meticulous matriarch. On the morning of her disappearance, Zoan and his spouse had departed early for the fields while the children attended school, leaving Min alone. Upon returning that evening to an empty house, inquiries with neighbors revealed that at approximately 9 a.m., Min had departed the residence on foot toward the national highway, presumably boarding a commercial transport heading toward the Thanh Son township. Following 3 days of zero communication, the family filed a formal missing persons report with local law enforcement. Nearly a month elapsed before rumors reached them from the neighboring commune regarding a charred body on a ridge that had been catastrophically misidentified and processed. Zoan was summoned by investigators to provide a biological sample for DNA matching. The results confirmed his worst fears. The immolated remains belonged to his sister. Law enforcement subsequently repatriated a funerary urn containing her cranium, a plastic enclosure containing the rendered mass, fragments of skeletal remains, clothing buttons, and her hair clip, Zoan recalled. The family was incapacitated by shock. We could not comprehend how her life could terminate in such an atrocious manner. The family subsequently conducted traditional obsequies for the deceased, supported by financial and manual contributions from the local populace. The definitive motive behind Dinh Thi Minh's death remains permanently obscured. The sole investigative baseline rested on the timeline provided by Dinh Van Tam, who discovered the site. Whether the victim committed self-immolation or was the target of a homicide and subsequent clandestine disposal remains an open question. Local lore suggests that Min had accumulated 2 gold earrings, valued at approximately 2 mace, chai. On the evening of her disappearance around 5 p.m., she had reached Thang Son Commune with the intent of catching a transit to Lafou. Failing to secure transport after a prolonged wait, she allegedly turned back. According to one investigative theory, after failing to secure a vehicle, she was intercepted by an unknown actor, robbed of her gold jewelry, and her body burned to destroy forensic evidence. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that while her utilitarian belongings were recovered in the ash, the gold earrings were conspicuously absent. Even under intense thermal exposure, gold would not vaporize. It would melt and solidify within the soil. If robbery was not the motive, it implies an unknown individual plundered the crime scene post-incineration. Conversely, village chief Hoang Van Dung indicated that the official police inquiry concluded the death was a suicide. Min lived an isolated existence without a spouse or descendants and had recently experienced domestic friction with her brother's family, potentially inducing a severe depressive episode. According to this narrative, after failing to secure transport to a relative's home, she procured gasoline using her plastic canister, ascended the isolated hill, gathered firewood, and committed self-immolation. This official conclusion, however, fails to satisfy the victim's immediate kin. Min's brother argued that her practice of carrying a canister was strictly for drinking water during long journeys. Furthermore, there was no logical rationale for her to travel to an unfamiliar, distant commune merely to commit suicide. Most damningly, if her intent was self-destruction, her decision to depart the residence with a fully packed bag of clothing remains entirely inconsistent with suicidal behavior. Reflecting on the catastrophic human error that defined the case, the commune chairman characterized the incident as a tragic anomaly born of circumstance. Had the citizens immediately notified local law enforcement upon discovering the anomalous mass rather than taking independent action, this profound tragedy would have been averted, the chairman stated. He further elaborated that nearly 3 decades ago, the geography was profoundly isolated, economic conditions were destitute, literacy rates were low, and the baseline civic awareness of the populace was severely restricted. These socio-economic factors created the perfect conditions for a horrific misunderstanding. Though a quarter of a century has elapsed, the grim legacy of the 1998 incident remains a permanent chilling fixture in the history of Bangkok.